Welcome back to our APES flipped classroom. Today we're continuing our conversations about land and water use, and we're continuing in the area of agriculture. And so we're going to be talking about pest control methods. So first thing we're going to talk about is pesticides. And pesticides is a really general and broad term. It means anything that affects or kills any sort of a pest. And so these are chemicals that are toxic to those pests. Now we can break pesticides down and we can talk about rodenticides, which kill rodents, fungicides, which kill fungi. We're not just talking about mushrooms here, but also about mold and mildew and other things like blight on plants. Insecticides kill insects and herbicides kill plants. Unfortunately, overuse of any pesticide can cause pests to become resistant to that pesticide. And this is through that evolutionary adaptation. Genetically, some pests are naturally going to be resistant to any pesticide. And of course, because those who are resistant to it are more likely to survive, they're more likely to pass those traits on to their descendants. And so the pesticide actually winds up selecting for the resistant organisms and allowing them to reproduce, because it kills the non-resistant ones and it leaves only the resistant ones. And those are the ones that survive and reproduce. So we get this thing we call the pesticide treadmill. So we start with a crop and it has pests on it. So we develop a pesticide and we apply that pesticide, and most of the pests are going to die, but some of those resistant individuals are going to survive. And because those resistant individuals are the ones that survive, they're the ones that reproduce, and their offspring are likely to have that same resistant trait. And so over generations, the proportion of the individuals that are resistant in that population increases. So the next season, the farmer applies the pesticide again, and it doesn't work very well. And now we have a crop infested with pests again, and now we have to develop a new pesticide. It's not always a new pesticide. Sometimes it's increasing the dosage. So it can be changing the pesticide, it can be increasing the dose, but what we find is that because pests tend to be short-lived species, their evolutionary or adaptation time is very short because they have multiple generations in a short amount of time. And so here's an example. As we have planted more of the genetically modified corn crops, those BT or Bacillus thuringiensis crops that make their own pesticides, you can see that as the hectares, the millions of hectares of crops that are planted with this BT corn increase, so too the number of species that are resistant to that BT is also growing. And so this creates the need to plant ever more that it creates its own pesticide, and it creates species that are ever more resistant. Genetic modification is a slightly different way of handling pests. With genetic modification, we add the gene for that pest resistant trait to the plant through genetic modification. So BT corn is a great example. There is a bacterial gene that is spliced into BT corn that produces these crystals that are toxic to the caterpillars that eat corn or cornworms. There's another type of genetic modification. One of the really common examples is something called Roundup ready crops. So these are genetically modified to be resistant to glyphosate, which is commercially known as Roundup, so that a farmer can spray his entire crop with Roundup and it'll kill the weeds, but it won't kill the crops. And so in this case, this genetic modification is not replacing a pesticide, but making application of a pesticide easier. So here's our BT corn. We've talked about this one before. It's been engineered to create the BT crystals within the cells of the plant so that when the caterpillars eat it, it kills the caterpillars and protects the plant. This does actually reduce the amount of pesticides that the farmer has to use, but what we're finding is that the organisms are developing a resistance to the BT crystals. That said, the application of BT corn has decreased insecticide use because the corn makes its own insecticide. And so farmers are not having to apply a separate pesticide. Roundup ready crops have actually increased the use of Roundup because the crops aren't harmed by it. So genetic modification can increase the use of pesticides if it's making the crop resistant to the pesticide, or it can decrease the pesticide use if the crop is supposed to be more resistant to the insects on its own. Unfortunately, genetically modifying crops means that the crops are all genetically identical, so there's no genetic diversity in the population. So if there's a disease or a pest that does affect these genetically modified crops, they're all vulnerable, and there's no chance of there being a genetic mutation that provides that adaptive trait that can then be passed on to offspring. So if we look at an example here, we have a field where we have a diverse crop of potatoes, and when a blight hits, it kills off only certain species of the potatoes or certain genetic phenotypes of the potatoes. And so some of the potatoes survive. If, on the other hand, we have a genetically modified potato, a cloned potato, and it's susceptible to the blight, nothing's going to survive. And so it's a classic example of an improvement in one department that can create a problem in another. All right, so here's your practice FRQ for today. I'd like you to describe one economic advantage and one economic disadvantage of using genetically modified crops. All right, and that's it for today. If you have any questions, as always, I look forward to hearing them in class.